Good morning, and thanks for attending this keynote session at this year's CyberXchange. This session is going to review the notions about what's happening in the new face of security operations and how that's changing the priorities for both CISOs and their leadership teams and boards. Well, hello, my name is Jonathan Nguyen. I'm a Vice President and Field CISO at Fortinet. And so today we're going to talk about how this pandemic is really reshaping the way we conduct commerce, communicate, and go forth. Just a standard disclaimer for the legal folks. So again, what we're going to do today is we're going to review what's happening in the industry, a short review about Fortinet if you haven't heard about us, what's happening in this quote new normal, those changing priorities and how that's reshaping commerce and security and operations. We're going to talk about the board concerns in addition to the CISO concerns and around this notion of reasonable care and how that manifests itself in a couple of big buzzwords we've been hearing lately about with regards to zero trust and SASE. And then finally, we'll summarize that and give you an idea about what we think is an appropriate move going forward. So if you haven't heard about Fortinet, we're probably the best kept secret in cybersecurity because we're an engineering company. We're founded by engineers and led by engineers, and we really haven't spent that much on marketing, but we have lately. And what we're seeing is that we are the #1 pure play cybersecurity company in the world in terms of the most of devices deployed, the most validated from the analyst community and the testing labs. We have the most patented inventions and innovations, more than the industry combined. And we have the broadest portfolio. And the market cap today is about $22–23 billion. And just to give you an idea of how that's changed, I came on board 4 years ago, and the market cap was 6.5 billion 4 years ago, and today it's 23. Annual billings of about $2.6 billion, 660 patents, and that's our own innovations, and that really speaks to the approach that this company has in terms of organically building out intellectual property. With more than 30% of all the firewalls shipped in the world, and more than 475 customers, 1,000 customers around the world, what you see is we have a tremendous amount of visibility and insight into the industry in terms of what's happening and what's really going on in the wild. And so that's why we're the #1 pure play cybersecurity company in the industry. This slide is interesting. Not only does it tell you that 7 out of 10 Fortune 100s utilize Fortinet, I think across here, what you see are verticals from all the critical national infrastructures, from telcos to aerospace to retail to pharmaceuticals, financial services. But I think, what this really says is there's a couple of dozen $1 trillion worth of brand equity that relies on Fortinet for its security. And I know that because my background is, well, I came to Fortinet 4 years ago to work on strategy. But prior to that, for 16 years, I was at Verizon, a Fortune 20 global backbone carrier, where I was part of the leadership team for managed security services. And I left Verizon after 16 years as a security CTO, running the team that produces the data breach investigations report. So in my experience, having used Fortinet technology and others, and having seen root cause analysis of about 12,000 different data breaches, what's really important is to understand how much due diligence goes into each of these enterprises and nation states in their decision to adopt Fortinet technology. And I think that's borne out by this slide, which is our analyst slide. And the marketing people are really proud of this because it shows you that, look, we've got more analyst recognition and accolades than anybody else in this industry. It speaks to, one, the breadth of our portfolio, the breadth of our market, and the customers we have, and the variety of that. And that speaks in the Gartner report to a large degree. But as an operator, my DNA really focuses on looking at NSS Labs recommendations because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the technology is really assessed on whether it delivers as advertised. And as you can see, we have the most NSS Labs recommendation across the industry. Now let's talk a little bit about this pandemic and what's happened over the last 15 weeks. So it's been interesting, but in many ways, the pandemic really just accelerated those macro trends that we saw, almost 5 years ago in many ways. This slide is an old slide. This is the slide I first used when I joined Fortinet back in 2016. And it seems as though the pandemic has really just accelerated those macro trends and exacerbated some of those challenges and risks that we identified back then. So clearly today's network is completely borderless. I think the advent of not only remote working en masse, but edge-based computing, integrated smart factories, smart cities, smart infrastructure, really means that that network is borderless. It's hybrid in many ways. So there are elements that are on the edge, there are elements that are in your legacy private data centers and clouds, there are elements that are in the largest public clouds around the world. And of course, it's faster than ever. With the advent of 5G, which is 100 times faster than 4G and much more accelerated computing, and digital transformation, which drives the idea of data-driven decision making and accelerated decision making for optimized business outcomes. It means that security really has to keep pace with the speed of business today, or it becomes irrelevant. And that brings us to the point where security and networking really need to be hand in hand in order to ensure the digital success of any enterprise. And all that means that today's environment is much more complex than it's ever been. The compliance requirements haven't changed. In fact, in many ways, they become more robust, more burdensome in some cases. And then the threat environment is far more complex, far more accelerated than ever before. And so 4 years ago, these challenges were prescient. They're even more so now as we go into this pandemic and really begin thinking about what we do next. And so what emerged very clearly over the last 15 weeks is that the companies that were digital natives, the companies that were cloud first, the companies that had embraced digital enterprise were able to weather the storm relatively well. Even the ones that were traditional brick and mortar stores, the ones that were retail. I met with the CIO of a vitamin shop just last week, and he was telling me about how they had to change their retail model, their distribution model, the way they interact with their customers to grow. And they're growing now as a retail business with brick and mortar stores. The key was using digital technology to change the way you interact with the brand to allow the customers to access that brand in any medium at any time that they wish. And so what we're seeing now is that the pandemic really has accelerated digital transformation. And at the same time, we've seen two macro trends happen simultaneously, which we've never seen before. In computing, we've seen the yin and yang of the distributed versus centralized and distributed computing, but we've never seen them happen at the same time. We went from mainframes, servers, to desktops, to cloud. But now we're seeing both a movement to distributed, decentralized computing in the form of edge-based computing and remote working. At the same time, we're seeing a move towards centralized computing in cloud. And so those two dynamics happening simultaneously present a lot of problems. In the midst of this, what we're seeing are that business outcomes and customer experiences are the primary goals of all board members, whether they're CIOs, CMOs, COOs, or CISOs or CSOs. What's key is delivering on the business outcome. And increasingly, because of digital transformation and that digital enterprise and contactless commerce, the customer experience is almost as important, because without a really exceptional enhanced customer experience, you're simply not going to achieve your business goals. And that underlines this need for really tightly integrated, broad, and automated capability. It requires both the security elements and the network elements to really work hand in hand and in sync, along with a unified capability for management and analytics. And that's why those traditional IT KPIs are almost less relevant today. I would argue that in many ways, if the business objectives, meaning productivity, meaning revenue, and the customer experience metrics aren't met, those traditional KPIs in terms of mean time to detection, mean time to mitigation, true false positive rates, vulnerabilities are not as relevant, because the key is the outcome. Underlining that, of course, are those KPIs. Now, contactless commerce and contactless healthcare, financial services, public services are all forcing CISOs and their boards to rethink business models. And the element across all of these conversations I've had, in fact, over the last 15 weeks, I've had conversations with about 250 of your peers around the world at the C-level and executive leadership teams. And they are all focused on better ways of serving their customers by giving them seamless access to the resources, products, and services that they wish at an accelerated pace. Everyone talks about accelerated time to market, accelerated revenue recognition, accelerated service to the public, whether it's public sector or private sector. In fact, I met with a nation state government, and they are accelerating their cloud first and digital first strategy to just do just that very same thing, to enable faster access for the coders and developers to the online resources so they can get their applications and workloads into the public space in an accelerated time frame. And at the same time, they're also opening up their ecosystem so that the citizens can find better ways of interacting with City Hall in a time of their choosing, on a device of their choosing, in a manner of their choosing. And so when we look at this, acceleration is the key thing. It's accelerating those cloud implementations for quick, seamless access. I think one of the things a CIO told me was that the wait time has to be less than 2 seconds. Anything more than 2 seconds begins to jeopardize that experience. In fact, anything approaching 5 seconds, you can guarantee that person's gonna go somewhere else. And so there's been a big drive to be cloud natives, literally overnight. And that's challenging because it exacerbates those shortages that were in the marketplace before we started, which were in cloud and security architects. And so I think that's going to be a cause of confusion. The lack of skill sets and guidance and advisors on how to properly migrate and secure your cloud environment is going to lead to possibly more gaps in visibility, control, and understanding. And we're going to talk about why those gaps are so key. And so moving forward, hyperscale operations are going to be the key. And that's one of the reasons why we rolled out our latest data center next generation firewall chassis, which is designed to handle millions of simultaneous connections, all of which will have to be applied, some zero trust principles. Like every request for network access is going to have to be identified, authenticated, validated, logged and monitored, and the final disposition understood. And so when you're doing that across 8, 10, 12 million simultaneous connections, you're going to need an architecture that's hybrid, that can support your legacy on-prem environments, your legacy private clouds, and then a hybrid across the largest public clouds in the world. And to do that at speed and scale and deliver a seamless customer experience. And that's the challenge. And that's why I think the Fortinet security fabric is so unique. So moving forward, hybrid is the new normal, and it's going to be complex and far more complex. And I think some backdrop of some of these conclusions was clearly laid out last year. Here are some of the comments and predictions that Gartner said back in 2019, before we moved into this pandemic. And it's structured around the idea that what happens as more and more enterprises and organizations move into the cloud. Well, certainly you're going to see a 60% reduction in fewer security incidents. Why? Because you've got someone on your team, someone who's looking at the infrastructure, looking at the platform, looking at the software in some cases, to make sure that all of those mundane tasks are handled. Second, but at the same time, because customers really are finding it challenging to understand both the shared responsibility model, but also the complexity of managing and monitoring security, across 5, 6, 7 different public clouds and their own private clouds. I mean, the challenge is it's very difficult if you're using multiple partners and multiple platforms and vendors and technologies to essentially swivel chair between management consoles across these different ecosystems and try to have visibility and control across all of that. And that, plus the complexity and the lack of understanding and shared responsibility models, means that 95% of the problems are still the customer's fault. And by the way, that's a good point there, because no matter what we do, we're the risk owners. We can never transfer the ownership of that risk. We can transfer the way we go about identifying and managing risks, but we are all risk owners, and that never leaves us. And so it's always our responsibilities. And then, of course, this statistic, which is the same across a lot of research I've seen over the last 12 odd years, which is that 99% of all the vulnerabilities exploited will be known for at least a year. And that's very consistent. It demonstrates that even when we have perfect information about threats, about the location, about the state of that device, about what needs to be done, we're still failing on basic security hygiene and security fundamentals like vulnerability and patch management. So what does that tell you if we're failing on something as basic as that before we enter the level of complexity that we're seeing in the pandemic? It means that unless we really begin to rethink things, that things could get a lot worse. A little perspective about what didn't happen is also important as well. And so what didn't happen were the wide-scale network outages that a lot of folks had feared. And so this comes from a very good friend of mine in the telco and service provider industry. And he told me, look, we were able to scale as a service provider. We noticed the shift to the edge, but we saw things in this case, the video conferencing traffic spike up to 5,000% times what they were prior to the pandemic yet. But note that while it ramped up, things began to normalize on weekends. And so I think it also demonstrates that we've adapted relatively well to this remote working strategy. At the same time, huge spikes in VPN traffic as well. Again, what didn't happen was that because of business continuity planning and resilience planning, the network providers were able to scale and surge with demand. And on the most part, we were able to manage and maintain our business, with the exception of those times when my kids and yours probably were playing Fortnite or on the air gaming. But at the same time, I think let's look at the threat environment and what's changed over the last 15 weeks. So certainly remote working and contactless commerce and digital transformation exacerbates those problems we talked about before. We've seen a rise of both automated opportunistic attacks, but as well as targeted attacks. And it was interesting in about week 3, NIST over here in the US came out with some guidelines and best practices. And I noted a couple of things that were very telling here. I think for the first time, we're seeing a large public message that says, look, you really have to assume that cyberspace is not just a multidimensional operating domain, but it really is a multidimensional hostile operating domain. And we really have to assume that the networks are already compromised, that the facilities, the networks, devices that we use, both our own and our partners, are also likely compromised and contain threats. Even those devices that our employees use to interact with our data centers, with our cloud resources, are most likely compromised and are actively being used against us. And so some key points here. That one, zero trust, which we'll talk about in a lot of buzz lately, is not enough. If you have to presume that you're already breached and compromised, then zero trust in and of itself is not enough. And therefore, you really need to have a very integrated, broad, and automated capability and defense in depth. And the second point, security and networking have to work together to deliver the success of that digital enterprise. The notion that you're going to operate in separate silos really is not a reasonable approach moving forward. And then the last one is this, is that our ecosystem is much more hybrid, much more distributed now, and their security has to be on all of these edges. These edges are anything from our homes, our offices, our legacy infrastructure. Those edges are the LAN edge, the WAN edge, indeed the cloud edge, and therefore security has to be not only bolted on, but integral and integrated and holistically managed with analytics and AI across all of these edges in order to be successful. And so the pandemic's also driven a couple of things I'm seeing that your peers are telling me. Automation, operations, and budget constraints. So most CISOs are now pausing right now. They're pausing to reflect on what's happening and think about their next steps, because the adrenaline rush in the first 8-9 weeks is over. And now it's really about maintaining steady state and thinking about what contactless commerce means moving forward into the third and fourth quarters of this year. Some have experienced furloughs, some have had to lay some people off, some are having hiring freezes. And so it says that across the industry, there are differing experiences depending on the enterprise and their industry. At the same time, nearly everyone is telling me that those large IT cross-organizational projects have been halted and the spending has been deferred. I think that's being borne out in some of the numbers from the vendor community in the last couple of days. But at the same time, they're tracking productivity metrics. They're looking at how does those internal KPIs and processes align to business outcomes and customer or user experiences. At the same time, what you see here is that working from home has problems and there are limits of collaboration. I think one of the interesting things here is that graphic over there, which is that almost 9 out of 10 security leaders say that they're struggling over visibility. They were struggling over visibility before we moved things to the edge, before we moved more things to the cloud. And so I think that struggle is even more critical today than ever before. I think that we're at the point of diminishing returns in security operations that are done remotely. I think the tier 1, tier 2 type triaging, most CISOs are telling me that's beginning to be hampered because those are less experienced folks. They're doing the initial investigation. Those are where they really relied upon those team rooms, those fusion centers to really work in a collaborative fashion to determine the nature of that event and whether it needs to be escalated. Tier 3 seems to be working okay because those folks are more mature. They have a lot more experience. By the time things get onto their desk, it's pretty much packaged. They can do the investigations remotely. So that begins to give you a vision about how I think security operations are going to shift moving forward. But clearly working from home, distractions are leading to more mistakes. Training and training on new technologies is more difficult now. And then you've got that whole issue about BYOD, home devices and home networks, which were never designed for remotely enterprise-grade security. And so I think there's a lot more focus on security awareness training, on endpoint protection. But more importantly now, the big shifts in security operations will be around remote access, not only supporting remote access for your stakeholders, but remote access for your security staff, for your SOC operators. And if you're an MSSP, for your customers, the ability to interface with those SOC operations remotely in a single pane of glass, a dashboard, if you will. And you're going to need AI-driven security operations because one, the shortage in security personnel and skills and expertise is not going away. And there's no way of addressing a problem that's growing at machine speed with humans. And so I think AI-driven operations and automation are going to be a key moving forward. And I say that because here's a picture that a good friend of mine has allowed me to share. This is his home stock. And as you can see, there are 9 display panels here, and there are 3 keyboards, and there are 2 microphones. And so while we can do it, you begin to see some of the problems about trying to maintain and security across a very distributed enterprise when you have teams of people working like this around the world. Gaps begin to appear. And so I think that's why we are going to move towards AI-driven security operations here. It's really about applying intelligence across both factors of security, right? In the last couple of years, there's been 2 schools of thought. Is it security around prevention before the boom, or is it detection and during and after the boom? I think automation is going to be the key here because these events are happening and attacks are happening so fast, and the cascading effects are happening so fast that in order to understand and apply controls, you're going to need to automate that. In fact, we rolled out a product called the Virtual Security Analyst, which is part of our AI offering. And what we began seeing in week 5 of the operational testing of that particular product was that the virtual security analyst and the AI in that began to outperform consistently the human counterparts at week 5. And after week 10, we were able to demonstrate that not only are they functionally far more effective and accurate than the humans. Humans are variables. They tend to be good, bad, or indifferent. But AI was consistently self-learning and improving upon itself. And at week 10, we were able to discern that one virtual security analyst, that is our AI offering, was the equivalent to 5 average humans. So I think that's a key insight, and that's going to be how we solve some of the challenges in security operations moving forward, both in terms of speed and scale and acceleration, but also putting humans and elevating them to areas that humans are really good at, which is typically going to be your higher level investigations capabilities, tier 2, tier 3. Across the board, last year I had conversations with 500 different CISOs, and they're continuing conversations that they're all rethinking their approaches. We've moved from point defense products to platforms, but really now we really are thinking about security fabrics, which are far more integrated, not only with a certain vendor's technology, like our security fabric, but also integrates with third-party services, right? Whether there are things like trust engines and analytics, or platforms like ServiceNow, for instance, which we integrate with, or the 6 largest public clouds. And it's also now an opportunity to think about consolidation. Do we really need to have so many different devices performing roles? Is there an opportunity now to consolidate that into a form factor that makes sense, whether it is an integrated security stack with SD-WAN for networking, or whether that's a VM of that instance, or whether we need to go to a security as a service and it's all cloud-based? I think one of the key points moving forward is that CISOs and their boards are really demanding agility and flexibility in solutions and offerings from the vendor community. And why? Because across the board, I saw that there were functional silos, there was a lack of visibility, there were still evolving threats, and everyone said that they were having not enough staffing, not enough expertise, not enough tools and processes. But I note this, the largest staffs, the largest data breaches happened in companies with the largest staff, the deepest budget. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Admiral Rogers when he was the head of the US Cyber Command. He said, Jonathan, look, cybersecurity is not a DIY exercise. The adversary approaches it as an organization, as a team, formal or informal. So the idea that you're going to take on this type of threat environment by yourself and you're going to do it by yourself is simply unreasonable. And I think now, more than ever before, is the right time to think and rethink our approach on cybersecurity. And even if we were to do it ourselves, the skill sets that we're encountering really are not optimal. Why? Because the industry as a whole has only been around for 25 to 28 years. The pool of security experts with 20 plus years of cybersecurity experience is pretty limited. In fact, what you see here is demonstrated by friends at Krebs is that, look, the vast majority of people who apply for these positions are lacking common exploitation techniques expertise. They're lacking expertise in computer architectures. They're lacking expertise in networking. And without those 3 central pillars, I think it becomes very difficult to perform at a high level in this industry. And so I think picking your partners, picking your teammates is the key to achieving success in cybersecurity. So, but despite everything we do in terms of technologies, controls, automation, artificial intelligence, all those good things we do, humans are going to be humans. And so I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular. So I look at myself. And so, we get trolled all the time. And here's what I found about a year ago. This came from a young lady named Chris Harris. So this is my own LinkedIn page. And she asked me to link in. So how does someone so young in this industry have so many connections? I began to look a little bit more. She's self-employed. The name of her employer is obfuscated. I see that she went to the University of Kentucky. So for those who aren't familiar with our NCAA college basketball league, that's the home of the University of Kentucky Wildcats. And she lives in Charlottesville, which is home of the University of Virginia, which is the home of the Virginia Cavaliers, arch rivals. So there is no way a self-respecting Wildcat would ever live in Cavalier country. So I thought that was pretty odd. So it asked me to investigate some more. And I said, wow, 127 of my mutual connections, and I'm ashamed to say this, there are more now that are connected to her. So I said, well, who are these people that I know so well that are connected to young Chris Harris? And it turns out that they were the HR people from senior levels in the intelligence community, senior levels in the law enforcement community, and amongst them were 3 CEOs of publicly traded cybersecurity companies, which if I named them, you would all know because they've all given speeches like this and they're always in the press. So it shows you that even cybersecurity pros will be human and they often fall prey. In fact, before I was in IT, I was a U.S. diplomat. And when I was going through the U.S. Foreign Service Institute, the training they gave us is that, Jonathan, remember that there are 3 great sins or weaknesses that are root of all evil: sex, money, and vanity. And understanding that goes a long way towards applying a counterintelligence approach towards cybersecurity. So I asked my friends over at FortiGuard Labs, which is our threat research capability in Fortinet, which is based actually outside of Vancouver in Canada, who is Chris Harris? And they came back and said, look, Jonathan, she's stock photography. She's certainly not a young lady in Charlottesville, Virginia. Most likely this is a Russian or Chinese troll. But playing on those human weaknesses is nothing new. This is an example that goes back to, I think, 2020, some 20 years ago. This is the I love you version of that. But humans are humans, and that doesn't involve IT. I think it's a human trait. Here's a horrible story about a young lady, well, maybe not young lady, but a woman who was killed by an alligator in South Carolina. And why was she killed by the alligator? Because she wanted to get close to the alligator. So there are certain things that you just simply cannot fix in human beings sometimes. And it applies in cybersecurity as well. For myself, here's an email I got from the UN, supposedly. It said that I had been randomly selected for $920,000 in US cash for coronavirus support. Yeah, so lucky me, but clearly that didn't fall for that one. Here's one that preyed on Israeli soldiers. They're tricking them to install malware because they were posing as women, but they were really the enemy. They were Hamas agents. So again, sex, money, and vanity. And so these challenges become even more persistent during a pandemic because the malware, the phishing attacks are far more sophisticated. They look very real. They look very compelling. And no matter what, they play on those human weaknesses. And we think about that. Security awareness training is going to be key moving forward. In this recent survey, shockingly, 4 out of 10 organizations punished the staff for cybersecurity errors. Can you believe that? And they range from things like 15% naming and shaming their employees. A third of them were decreasing access privileges, which sounds reasonable. And almost 2/3 informed their line managers, which is also reasonable. And 17% locked down their computers until appropriate training took place. I think personally that should go much higher. I think that should be well on the order of about 50%, depending upon the criticality of what was accessed. So clearly demonstrates that we also have to take in the human factors as well. But as we said earlier, during my time running the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, my work with our own FortiGuard Threat Landscape Report, and the Cyber Threat Alliance, of which we are a founding member, there's some things that I've seen that are recurring problems. They're systemic and they're structural. They don't go away because they happen year over year. And I think they begin to really challenge us as we try to do this idea of trusted computing over untrusted networks. And so I'll point you to just literally the last three statistics because we're having, I don't want to go through that much time here, but look, almost 1 out of 5 breaches are caused by human errors. Wow. Almost 8 out of 10 breaches are discovered not by the internal security team or the service provider, but discovered by the victims, law enforcement, and researchers, meaning someone is out there saying, hey, by the way, there's stuff on the dark web that suggests you've been breached. Or someone is getting a credit monitoring alert that says, hey, someone is monetizing your credit information. Or the law enforcement people have found something and are telling you. What does that mean? That scares and shocks me because look, we're going to spend $130+ billion on network security this year. And we're growing year after year. And after all of that spending and human effort, 8 out of 10 security breaches are not found by security teams. What does that tell you? It tells you that there are gaps in visibility, awareness, and understanding and control that make it so that we're failing here. And these problems occur year over year. And why do I know that? Because when you look at all the threat research, I challenge you, go look at the executive summaries of all the major threat research reports over the last 10 years. And I guarantee you, the recommendations all talk to some form factor of basic security, hygiene, and controls. And that tells you that we're making mistakes at basic levels, right? And so we need to reevaluate our approaches as we think about contactless commerce. And CISOs I'm speaking with are doing that today, and they're really rethinking that. This is more evidence that, again, the vast majority of data breaches that occurred last year came from unapplied security patches. Wow. What does that tell you? It tells you that we're failing on basic things, and we need to get those right as we move forward. And by the way, as we move forward with digital transformation, it creates more edges. Why? Because compliance and risk of the infrastructure are all now exposed in greater edges. They're on that IoT LAN edge, they're on the cloud edge, they're on the 5G edge, they're on the data center LAN edge, they're on the WAN edge, they're on the cloud edge. All these edges are both points of ingress and egress, and they're points of control. And we've got to get our arms around that. At the same time, as these gaps are appearing, I give this link here to a guy who's one of my heroes in cybersecurity. This guy named Rob Joyce. And he works now as the director of operations at our national security agency. He ran what was called tailored access operations. He is admittedly the leading APT for the US government. His job of his and his team is to attack our adversaries out there. And so back in 2015 into 2016, he gave 3 speeches, which I thought were really telling. And I will tell you, the 40 minutes on this particular video is worth your time and your employees' time, because he talks about how advanced persistent threat actors like himself really work. So I thought it's really telling to hear what he has to say about security and what his recommendations were, and to see how they apply to our learnings moving forward. And so he says, don't assume that any crack is too small. Don't assume that any of those cracks on those edges, as we were talking about, because that is what his team and APTs and advanced threat actors all focus in on. They focus on those cracks and those edges, and they exploit them because they know at some point someone's going to open up that edge, that device, and that's when they're going to parachute or helicopter in. And so there's a big difference between understanding what is actually in your network as opposed to what you think is in a network. The APTs around the world really are focused on persistence in reconnaissance, persistence in compromise, and ultimately in the damaging of your network. So the key, he said, was, do you really understand what's in your network and who's attempting to access those resources and what are they doing with that? And that points to the key thing, lack of visibility and control. So when you look at all that and you say, well, what are his recommendations? Well, they were what? Limit access privileges, they segment your networks, remove those hard-coded passwords. He talked about monitoring your network activity for anomalous behavior, and then hire a sysadmin that actually reads the logs and listen to him or her. These are pretty basic controls. Again, they reflect my thinking that we're failing on those basics. And if we don't get them right as we move forward, we're going to have bigger problems. So the FBI has the same recommendations, right? These are recommendations in line with the new threats that they're seeing out of C19. What are they talking about? Backing up critical data, copying critical data, updating your AV software, using secure networks, right? 2-factor, multi-factor authentication, and patching your networks. So the question you've got to ask here is, why is it that we're failing on those basic things? You would think that these are all represented in those basic security controls. We're failing because the level of complexity we have in this ecosystem makes it hard for us to have a holistic, unified, and global approach in security. And more bad news is that that's going to get more complex, because now the environment that we have is much more distributed, much more hybrid. It's both our legacy data centers, it's also clouds, public, private clouds, and those endpoints and all things trying to access those things, but it's also the edge. And so edge-based computing, as I'm going to show you, is going to accelerate and overtake traditional notions of computing and networking. And what's really interesting as we think about that here is moving from left to right. You have your users, you have unknown users, known users, trusted, untrusted devices, all attempting to use the network to access a workload application. And what we found here, the primary determinant in quality of service, the quality of the experience, has been SD-WAN. What we do at Fortinet is we integrate our SD-WAN with our security, and what that gives you is the ability to have really sound security with an SD-WAN that optimizes the network access methodology to deliver that enhanced customer experience. So as we said earlier, unless you have a customer experience that has good bandwidth, good network availability, low latency, high reliability, you're not going to have a good experience. If you don't have that good experience, you're not going to achieve the business outcome. Those edges are only going to appear in more places and increase over time. I won't belabor this point. You'll get a copy of that. If you take nothing more from my talk, remember this bit of information here. This is the evolution of computing and networking for the last 20 years. So you've seen we've gone from terminals and mainframes to PCs and servers to mobile devices and endpoints to cloud. What we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years is that edge-based computing is going to eclipse the cloud computing that we have today. Now today, 85% of the data generated in computing is done in our cloud environment and our data centers. Those are our legacy workloads and those applications. But as we integrate and implement 5G, and we move computing to the edge, to smart factories, smart cities, smart homes, those wearable technologies, they're going to generate the vast majority of data, and the computing is going to be done on the edge. Why? For accelerated arbitrage, accelerated business outcomes, accelerated data-driven decision-making. And that drives computing closer to the edge. And that's facilitated by 5G. But what we're going to see there is that only 20% of the data that's going to be generated will be sent back to the cloud for correlation and for storage. And so tomorrow's security and networking challenges, how do you get your arms around all of this, all of these points of complexity? Because I guarantee you, for an enterprise today, they're going to have elements of some of these. And there will be organizations, larger enterprises, global enterprises, nation state governments that will have elements of every single element here. They're still going to have mainframes. Mainframes aren't going away. They're still going to be here. Data lakes, private data clouds are going to be here. And then you're going to have all those things that are happening with edge-based computing. And so the challenge for a board and for a CISO or a CSO or CIO is going to be, how do you provide holistic security and networking across all of that? And so as a board level concern around security today and resilience, it's about reasonable care. When you look at all the regulatory standards across the board in NIST and the EU and GDPR, the Canadian standards, there is a specific phrase or variation of this phrase that's present in nearly all of them, which is you will undertake a reasonable level of care in the identification and management of risk. It's about reasonable care and managing risk. And this stems from both in the US and in Canada and the Commonwealth countries, this notion of reasonable care based on English common law, which is what would a reasonable person do knowing what he or she knows when they know it, right? And I'm not allowed to talk about a particular data breach, but I'll give you the information about that without naming the parties involved. In this case, there were 143 million Americans that were affected. The forensic investigation and the lawsuit afterwards concluded it was entirely preventable. I was actually one of them. The exploit was of a known Apache vulnerability. The breach happened sometime in May through July, but the board was notified in July, but they didn't tell the public until September. And in the interim months, the board members were trading stock. The exfiltration of data was due to an expired security certificate in one of those internal segmented firewalls. in the fall of 2018, they set up 2 websites where victims could request credit monitoring, not credit freeze, apologies on that. But both of those used expired certificates and became sources of watering hole attacks to re-victimize the original victims. And so the question that was asked of the courts was that reasonable? And the answer was no. They said that this corporation owed their consumers a reasonable level of care to safeguard their personal information. And so the message moving forward for boards right now, it's all about risk management. And what is reasonable care? It's about things like this CIS control. In fact, Kamala Harris, who's now the vice presidential candidate for the Democrat Party here in the US, when she was a state attorney in California, defined minimum reasonable care in cyber as the CIS controls. By the way, that is the only prescriptive definition in the world of what reasonable care is. So the challenge for CISOs and their boards is to define and determine that they have achieved that. And these are basic security controls across those 20 or really 148. But when you think about it, reducing admin, quick patching, they're the same things that are found in the NSA recommendations, the FBI recommendations, and my favorite ones, the Australian Signals Directorate, which have their essential 8 strategies and 35 mitigation strategies. So take a look at those. They're helpful. You know, from my old shop at Verizon, their latest report basically said that hackers and threat actors, irrespective of whether they're low, intermediate, or advanced, really are lazy. They prefer short paths. And therefore, the best way to ensure your security is defense in depth. Put as many layers of security in their way as you can to significantly decrease that chance that they're going to get access to the data. Again, this calls for something that is broad, integrated, and automated. So at the end of the day, what you see is that the practical realities of cybersecurity is hard, and digital transformation makes it harder. And CISO's priorities are all around that. In fact, you know, we've got some real challenges as an industry for CISOs and CISOs. You know, there was an article in Forbes last year that said, look, 1 out of 6, almost 18% of us are medicating ourselves with drugs or alcohol. And coming from a family of doctors, when I hear the word medicate, that's a very particular term of art. It's not recreational. It's not for fun. You know, it suggests that 18% of us are functional alcoholics, right? Which is very scary, because when you look at that survey, it also look 60% of the CISO survey said their CEO agreed that the breach was inevitable. I had so many conversations in the last 12 weeks with friends of mine, and they all share a common problem. You know, a deep understanding of Lipitor, of metformin, and various statins, because diabetes, heart disease, and cholesterol are common, I would say in my own experience, across some 40% of CISOs. And as they approach 48, 50, 52, that number goes even higher. And I think those types of problems and stresses are leading to an average lifespan of a CISO at about 12 to 14 months, right? Think about that, for instance. A lot of us are bailing out in 12 months, in 14 months. In the first 90 days, the first 3 months of that are just orientation. So I think the practical reality is, I've got to move a little bit faster for the sake of time, but that those gaps that we just spoke to from Rob Joyce are everywhere, and they're growing, and that you cannot presume that. And therefore, I think we really need to take a look at some zero trust principles. And we're going to talk about what zero trust means. But this idea that you have to apply least privilege access to all requests for network access become prescient. This cartoon really tells it like it is. I think the threat actors are out there. Everyone knows they're out there. They're telling you they're out there. They're quite brazen about it. And they're here to eat your lunch, or to implant ransomware and take your lunch. And so that's the environment we deal in. At the same time, we've got to achieve our business outcomes and deliver those customer experiences. So I think CISO priorities are now moving towards zero trust networking and this notion of SASE. And this idea about edge to edge, that's why we rolled out our Fortinet security fabric, because it is broad, it is integrated, it is automated. And that's the key to success here. You've got to have that holistic capability, because if you're doing this in a piecemeal fashion with multiple management consoles and 2 or 3 different panes of glass, if you will, you're going to fail. I hate to say it, because there's a difference between a single pane of glass and a single glass of pain. That's what one of my CISO friends told me about using management consoles. So I think moving forward, what you're going to see is a need to really have the convergence of network and security. At Fortinet, we have the fabric, which is our our notion of converged networking and security. Converged networking, whether it's on an appliance with our own ASICs to accelerate performance, whether it's on a virtual machine, whether it's cloud delivered, so that it's a unified security platform that really protects the users, the devices, the networks, and leverages our FortiGuard AI really to accelerate the SOC operations, to integrate that with accelerated NOC operations, right? And an open ecosystem that has over 360 partners. I think one of the key things is NOC SOC integration, and our tool sets like our Fortis team, for instance, allow that NOC SOC integration. Zero Trust was invented back in 2009 by an analyst at Forrester. I was one of the original customers who paid a tremendous amount of money to hear about this concept. And it essentially means that back then it said that you shouldn't trust a user request just because they're behind their firewall, because they're inside your perimeter. The idea now is that you shouldn't trust anyone based upon just their location, because now 90% of the staffs are working outside their network from home. And so the idea here is knowing and controlling everyone and everything that is on and off the network. Why everything? Because of IoT, there will be more entities than actual human users requesting network access. They're going to do it on a number and a range of devices, whether it's going to be agent or agentless security. The users will be in multiple locations. They'll need different form factors. And all of that needs to be married with unified management, analytics, and automation. And that's a big challenge if you're doing it yourself, I think. So SASE becomes online, and its basic assumption is that we need to provide edge-to-edge security. So it's basically security and networking. It's WAN optimization and a next generation firewalls in many ways. And so moving from left to right, you have your WAN optimization controller, 5G, SD-WAN, VPN, and routing for the wide area access networking, right? You gotta have that capability to access those resources that are in the cloud. At the same time, you have to bring on network security functions, typically in a next generation firewall, as well as a CASB and a web gateway. All those capabilities have to be integrated. SASE says you should do it mostly from the cloud. I think you should be a lot more flexible. And if those things work for you, some instances as an appliance, some instances as a virtual machine, or as a cloud delivery model, that's fine as well. But take a look at all. These are the basic capabilities. And so again, the requirement here is to have a lot of different security functionality. There's no way you're going to do it on one device unless you're using something like our Fortinet security fabric that integrates all those functions on a next generation firewall with SD-WAN. Or you can try to build this out yourself, or you can try to cobble together this technology and try to manage. You can. It really just depends on what level of complexity you can manage, your depth of experience, your resource budgets. As an operator, I found that I wanted to focus on operating technologies rather than worrying about integrating technologies and doing QoS around a slew of third-party technologies. So I think that our approach is a sound one. But we really believe that security needs to be agile. It needs to be flexible based upon a particular enterprise's needs, whether that is by an appliance, whether it's by a virtual machine, or whether it's something we call FortiSASE by firewalls as service. And here's a graphic representation of how we think all this should be laid out. And what you see here is the ability to have a very integrated and broad ecosystem that is designed out of the box to work together to collect and share information for that automated response, but also to integrate with over 360 different partners in the industry so that you don't strand your investment. That's the other thing being an operator is I would always worry about what would happen to what I bought 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in some cases, God forbid if you're still using that. But you don't want to make those stranding decisions. We're always looking for ways to how do we make an investment for today, for tomorrow, for 3-5 years out. And so my last slide, and when we talk about the changing roles and responsibilities and priorities of the board and for the CISO, it really is a combination of people, processes, and technology that has to be broad from that IoT edge, that home edge, that LAN edge, that WAN edge, that cloud edge, combined with processes and controls like the CIS 20 and those other standards and regulations and best practices that we alluded to, as well as the technology, which increasingly should not be point defense products alone or a series of platforms, but really need to be a security fabric. And doing that together in a way that delivers a reasonable level of care in your industry. Remember, the questions they ask you in the aftermath of a disruption or a data breach are always the three things they asked you after Watergate, which is what did you know, when did you know it, and what did you do about it? And then the last question that's going to be asked is, was that reasonable? And so I would say, look, take this opportunity to step back, take a pause, think about what's going to be happening next as we move into contactless commerce, and take a hard look about what you're doing, and is there a better way of doing that? And I think you may find that in this new normal where it's all complex, hybrid infrastructures, digital transformation is going to accelerate everything around contactless commerce. More remote working for yourselves, but also remote access for your customers and your stakeholders and accessing your network and your resources. This notion of edge to edge security, and those requirements, I think, more so than ever before, the macro trends in broad, integrated, automated, and flexible consumption models become really key, because the essence of success moving forward will be open ecosystems and agile ecosystems. And your security has to support that. And the board and the CISO priorities will all be aligned towards achieving that type of outcome. And with that, I want to thank you for your time today. That was a fast 50 minutes. And so now I will open it up for questions. Thanks.
CyberX. We do have a few questions coming in for you, and the first one being, as we are looking at a global shift in cyberspace due to the pandemic, how are the KPIs changing with AI automation and growing remote workforce?
Yeah, so I think with regards to, sorry, I'm getting an echo. So with regards to the cloud elements, what I would be looking for are the dwell time, the linger time, those customer experience metrics with regards to how they're utilizing those cloud resources. The key is going to be the obvious measurable ones will be things like revenue, but it'll be the dwell time, the amount of time they take to go through your website, for instance, and whether they're willing to refer you. Those are the metrics I would look at for the cloud. With regards to remote working, more so than ever, I would stress security awareness training. But as we said earlier, on average, before the pandemic, some 4 to 5% of the workforce were failing their security awareness training. Now, paradoxically, going into the pandemic, there was some new research from the various security vendors in the industry, and they released their findings on security awareness training of their staffs, and they were experiencing failure rates of 18 to 22%. And these are security workers, these are security professionals, and they're failing security awareness training. And I think it's because for the first time, a large degree are working outside the perimeter. And you really begin to find out, just how successful those security awareness training programs really were. But in lieu of that, I would say, look, focus on your endpoints, focus on securing those endpoints, monitoring those endpoints, and seeing what's happening there. EDR, MDR become key, because you have to have a compensating control, because people will be people, they'll be humans. I think the same thing applies to vulnerability management and patching. They're instrumental, they're great, but there are lots of things that hamper and stymie patching, things like unintended consequences, a lack of visibility about what's in your ecosystem, a hesitancy to take some things offline, or an inability to even reach those devices or applications, because if they're IoT, sometimes they're buried in concrete. And so compensating controls and internal segmented firewalls that has updated signatures is also an effective way of handling vulnerability management.
Thank you so much for that. We have about 6 minutes left till the end of the session, and the second question for you is, as you mentioned, networks are borderless. The pandemic has made this even more apparent. How do CISOs need to rethink authentication and access?
Yeah. So I think those zero trust principles really come in. So you have to identify the person, device that's being used, or the entity or the thing that's attempting to request network access. You have to authenticate them. So there, your identity and access management tools, whether they're tokens or whether they're cloud-based directories, become key. I think IAM becomes more powerful than ever before. Then you need to validate that person to make sure that the request or thing that they request is valid. So network access controls like our Fortinet capability allow you to have visibility over to everything that's either connecting to your network or attempting to connect to your network. validate that that request is legitimate, that Jonathan Nguyen, normally it comes into the office at 9 a.m. Eastern time. He has this laptop that's associated with him that's provided by the business. He's allowed to access the mail server. That all looks legitimate. But if it's Jonathan Nguyen accessing from, let's say, Hong Kong, and he's using a device that hasn't been registered before, not recognized before, and he's coming at a time that's not normal, does that make sense for him? Log and monitor everything for anomalous behavior, and there's a challenge, right? The sheer volume of connections. And then I would say use your UEBA, your user entity analytics, behavioral analytics, and your CASB, your cloud access security broker, to do two things. One, discern anomalous behavior and discern whether that's just anomalous or malicious. And then two, for the CASB, to really find out what the final disposition of the data was. What happened to that data that Jonathan downloaded from the cloud? Did he upload it to another cloud? Did he download it onto his laptop? Did he download it to attached storage media? That becomes very key as well. So I think with a borderless network and more remote access, the challenge is how do you provide easy access with really great security? And irrespective of what technology you end up using, I think the biggest step is going to be your data and user classification exercises, whereby you begin to understand, who your critical access users are, who has elevated privileges, what are the critical applications and assets and resources. And by the way, even with technology, this is the most time-consuming exercise. In many cases, it'll take 6-9 months. But I think with that, you have to understand who your critical people, assets, and resources are, and the underlying dependencies that are associated with those assets in order to make the decisions about risk. Okay.
Thank you so much for that once again. And we have about 4 minutes left, so I'll just throw in one more question for you. With quick on-demand cloud being the expectation, what are some new approaches to backing up and recovering cloud environments in the event of failure or outages?
Yeah. Well, I think the challenge there, first go through your data classification exercise and really understand the most important thing about backing up your data is to marry your backup strategies to the SLAs. The SLAs associated with your internal work processes and your workloads, that comes from that last thing I talked about, your classification exercise. If you understand the criticality of a particular workload, and you understand that you have to have an SLA of 30 minutes, 5 minutes, or 2 minutes or less, that becomes the interval and your KPI, your target about how you're going to back up your data sets. And you can structure that depending on which cloud service provider you utilize. And that's why I think having someone, it takes 9 months for a person to really understand the shared responsibility model. And that's why I think working with a partner is the key aspect, a partner that helps advises you on understanding your resilience strategy, your SLAs, understanding your underlying dependencies, and making sure that you align that with the requirements you set for that cloud provider. And the other challenge is going to be, how much resilience do you want? Do you want to replicate, back up that data with the same provider, or do you want to replicate that into your private cloud or into another cloud? And underlying that is that when you choose your security, whichever security products, technology, I of course think the Fortinet Security Fabric is key for this, but it's optimized at Fortinet so that you have the same security, whether it's on your prem, in your cloud, in someone else's cloud, in any cloud, it's the same security. And so I think those are basic things. And I know we're almost out of time. Can I add just one more thing? Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say this. One question that a lot of people ask me is this: what do you do personally, Jonathan? And I'll tell you, having been a member of the Foreign Service in the US, having been a victim of the OPM breach, having been a victim of about 6 major data breaches, I will tell you, look, I don't use credit monitoring. I use a credit freeze for myself, for my family, for my kids. Look, I essentially demonetize that risk, because by freezing my credit, even if someone has all of my information, I know someone does. I hope it's a nation state, because I know what they want to do with it. I hope it's not the mafia, because I know what they want to do with it. If you have a credit freeze, and you can request a credit freeze from the credit reporting agencies, you can do it yourself, or you can hire someone to do it for you. And their services, by all means do that, because it demonetizes the risk. So even if they have all your information, they cannot take out a loan, they cannot take out a mortgage, they cannot refinance your home, they cannot do anything with your data. That becomes the essence of that. And if you apply that at an enterprise level to demonetize that risk, that aligns with that last question about backing things up. If you back things up that align with your business SLAs, you negate the vulnerabilities and risk around ransomware. Okay.
Yeah, thank
Hope
you
that was
so
helpful.
much. It was definitely helpful. Thank you so much, and I'll just pass it back to you for a few closing remarks. And with that, yep, go ahead.
No, thanks. I just want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm hope next year that we'll be in person. I think that what's going to come from this pandemic is, I don't want to scare people. It's not about FUD. I just want to make sure people understand the expectations that are coming down the pike, this notion of contactless commerce, about all things accelerated. But don't forget the basics, because I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect upon what we did right, what we're doing wrong, and just think about things we spoke about: basic security controls. How do we automate that? How do we ensure that holistically? Do we really have good visibility into our ecosystems about the critical people, assets, underlying dependencies, those SLAs, and ensuring that all those factors are aligned to our security controls, our policies, and that those policies are aligned to a security strategy, and that strategy aligns to the business objectives of seamless access, business outcomes, and enhanced customer experiences. And I think when we do that, that's the opportunity we have today. So with that, I want to really thank everyone for their time today. Appreciate it.